All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we've sort of been alluding to the structure of a neuron, but today let's actually take some time to really go through the ins and outs of what that structure actually looks like. So first and foremost, let's talk about the cell body. So this can be located in a handful of places, as we've seen in some of the other pictures thus far. But typically, if we look at a general neural structure, this is how it's drawn. Regardless of where it's located, though, that cell body is where most of your neurons, organelles are located. So your nucleus, your ribosomes, your Golgi, your ER, the mitochondria, the whole nine yards. So all of that stuff that is typically what we would associate with the internal structures and organelles of a cell, that's located here in our cell body. Coming off of that cell body are your dendrites, and these are highly branched extensions that receive signals from other neurons. So this is where the incoming information comes from and to. If we look at the opposite end, then that's your axon. So the dendrites bring in the information, your cell body decides what to do with it, and then the axon is a much longer extension coming out of the opposite end of that cell body that will then ultimately transmit or send a signal somewhere else. And usually the ends of those axons send signals at these things called synapses. The connection point, this comb base that attaches the cell body to the axon, also has its own name, and that's called this axon hillox. That's going to be important when we start talking about whether or not this neuron will actually send a signal. So incoming signals are coming from those dendrites, but then there needs to be a certain threshold of information coming in before that signal will actually get sent, and sort of that decision-making point of, is there enough information to send a signal, typically happens here at this axon hillox. You've also got synaptic terminals. So one axon passes information across a synapse in the form of chemical messages called neurotransmitters. So you've got these synaptic terminals that hang out here. So here's your synapse, and then that terminal is kind of the end here where we'll actually send that signal, and that chemical signal typically comes from that synapse in the form of neurotransmitters. And so there's the synapse. So that's the actual junction itself, between the axon of one neuron and the next cell. And that next cell could be another neuron, or it could be some other sort of cell, like a nerve cell, for example, or a connection to a gland. So when we look at sending signals, we talk about it coming from presynaptic. This is the information coming in. So your presynaptic signal is the one bringing in the information from somewhere else, and transmitting that information across that cell or across that neuron. And then you've got your postsynaptic signal, who is now sending that signal next. That postsynaptic cell, like I mentioned a moment ago, can be another neuron, like you're seeing here in the picture, but it can also be a muscle, or it could be a gland if we're talking about sending information to those glands instead. Now, most of your neurons, when we look at the way that these guys are structured, so here are all your cell bodies of these neurons, right? They are set up and nourished and insulated by these things called glia. And glia cells are another neural structural cell, but they're not really there to send and receive signals. Instead, they're there to support those neurons. They're there to regulate, and augment their functions. So when we look at embryos, they produce all sorts of radioglia from tracts along newly formed neurons, as a way to sort of support them, to allow those neurons to form connections as they grow. You've also got astrocytes. These are cells that induce cell linings in your capillaries, in your central nervous system. This is really what's going to allow these tight junctions to form. And if you remember, we talked about these back when we talked about cell structure. Tight junctions are barriers that form from one tissue to the next, so you're not leaking fluid everywhere. In the sense that we're talking about your nervous system, specifically your central nervous system, those tight junctions are going to be what ultimately produces that blood-brain barrier. So it prevents blood from leaking into your central nervous system if it's doing its job and formed properly, and should also prohibit the leaking of cerebral spinal fluid out into the rest of your body. And that blood-brain barrier is a really interesting piece of tissue in your body in the way that it restricts the entry of a lot of substances into your brain. So when we're talking about producing, say, therapeutic drugs, for instance, if I need that drug to get to your brain, there's a lot of chemistry, biochemistry that we need to get around in order to get that substance across that blood-brain barrier, because generally speaking, your body doesn't want to let most substances across that barrier. And it's there as an evolutionary protective stopgap.
Hey there, I'm Ali Astrocyte, and you're watching the very first episode of Neurotransmissions. I'm excited to start this series, and hopefully you are excited to learn something about neuroscience. Are you ready? Let's begin at the beginning with the neuron.
Yes.
If you've ever opened up your biology book, you probably know that this is a neuron. But this is also a neuron. And so are all of these. Oh, wait. Neurons come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but they all have one job: to transmit information throughout your mind and body. Just like copper wire transmits electricity, or like telephone lines transmit calls, or fiber optic cables transmit data so that you can watch this video, neurons form the necessary connections to make you go. There are billions of neurons in your brain. Scientists estimate around 86 billion. Those neurons can each form more than 1,000 connections with other neurons, forming up to 100 trillion connections. This information superhighway is how you exist. It's the means by which you are able to move, see, hear, and even think about the world around you. But in order to understand something as complex as our senses, we first need to understand the neuron. As we saw before, they don't all look the same, but in general they have most of the same parts. Let's go over that. To begin, we have the cell body. This wider portion of the cell contains a lot of the bits and pieces of the cell that keep it alive and functioning. If we zoom in, we see that it houses the nucleus, where your DNA hangs out until it's needed to make proteins. It also includes things like the Golgi apparatus, which helps your cell organize, package, and move around different proteins. The endoplasmic reticulum, the place where proteins are folded into the correct shapes, and the mitochondria, which provide energy to the cell. You don't need to worry too much about those big words for the purpose of this video. But if you'd like to learn more about the parts of the cell and what they do, check out some of these resources, which are also located in the description below. For right now, just remember that the cell body is where the nucleus lives. Next, we see what look like tree branches extending from the cell body. These are called dendrites. Dendrites are generally the receivers of information into the neuron. If we increase our magnification, we see small bumps called spines lining the dendrites. Neurons and other cells communicate via these spines by passing information to them. This connection is called a synapse. We'll talk more about synapses and communication in later episodes. Just keep in mind that dendrites have so many spines and so many synapses that every neuron receives input from hundreds or thousands of other cells. There is a lot of communication going on in your brain. Back to the big picture. This long, thin piece extending from the cell body is called the axon. At the top here, we have the axon hillock. This is the gatekeeper that determines if a signal is strong enough to continue past the cell body. If a signal makes it past the axon hillock, it shoots down the axon. Axons can be very short, communicating with cells nearby, or very long. For example, the longest axon in your body runs from your lower back all the way down to your big toe. The axon can also have myelin wrapped around it. This acts as insulation and helps the signal travel faster down the axon. Myelin is kind of like the plastic that coats the outside of a wire, and it's important for allowing cells to communicate very quickly across your whole body. Finally, along the axon and at the end are synaptic terminals. This is where the neuron connects with the dendrites of other neurons to transmit information. And there you have it, a basic overview of the parts of a neuron. Neurons are the most well-known cell in your brain. But it's important not to forget the other cell types. Your brain also contains many tiny blood vessels, bringing nutrients and signals from the rest of the body to help your brain continue functioning. There are also cells called glia, which literally translates to glue. For a long time, it was thought that these cells only existed to provide nutrients to neurons. But recently there's been a lot of evidence that these cells influence the way neurons communicate and grow. Cells like microglia are important for the immune response, helping your brain fight off anything that might harm it and cleaning up dead cells. Oligodendrocytes help cells communicate faster by insulating the neurons using myelin. And my special favorite cells, astrocytes, are these beautiful starry-shaped cells that help support neurons and also seem to play a large role in creating synaptic connections between cells. So even though we'll talk a lot about neurons and their communication in your brain, don't forget that without those other cell types, the neurons wouldn't be much good on their own. Well, there you go. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe to become a Brainiac. I'd also love to hear your feedback in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in. Next episode, we'll dive into how neurons communicate. I'm Allie Astrocyte, and until our next transmission, over and out.